Stephen Jobs. I think it was about 2004. I wasn't there, but you could certainly watch it also on YouTube. And in that speech, he said a number of things that I was interested in. But at one point he mentioned, and you'll see why I'm going to bring it up, he said, in our lives, too often what we do is we spend too much time connecting the dots going forwards. And that is very important. And what we mean by that is you plan, you say, if I do this, it will lead to this, it will lead to this. But he made a point that was very interesting to me. He said, what may be just as important, if not more important, is to connect the dots going backwards. And what he meant by that is, and I'm giving my own interpretation, is as we think about it, in the next few weeks, even in months, and even right now, all of us are going to have certain experiences. We're going to face certain challenges. We're going to meet certain people probably online for the next few weeks. And at the time, these interactions may seem important and they may not. But 5-10 years from now, you're going to look back and say, if this had not occurred, I would not be where I am today. And I feel this very strongly. The experiences we provide our children today, they are going to certainly remember. So as I listened to Stephen Jobs, who we all know is the founder of Apple Computer, as I listened to Stephen Jobs, I thought about some of the experiences I had as in my career that led me to develop what I call, a strength-based model that you're going to hear about today. So I always feel that an audience should know a little about a speaker and what got that speaker so interested in the topics he or she has written about or presented about. So I just want to tell you a little about myself. Then I want to tell you about a very powerful interaction, connecting the dots backwards, that I had with a particular boy that was really to change my life. So after I got my bachelor's at City College of New York, and I should tell you, psychology was my third major. I always love it when some people say to me, college, since I don't know what I want to be. I said, I didn't change to psychology or transfer to as a psychology major till I was a senior. And I graduated psychology major, and then I moved up to Massachusetts, and I got my doctorate at Clark University, which is in Worcester, Massachusetts. I don't know about any of you who, but I remember when I got my doctorate, for some reason, I naively thought, now that I have a doctorate, I should know what I was doing. I still wasn't certain what I was doing. And so what I decided to do is, and by the way, I was even more anxious because now they were calling me doctor. I basically said, I need more training. And I knew that I was probably going to come back to New England. I had grown to love the area while I was in graduate school, but I said, see a part of the country that you really may not spend time in again. And so I went out and did my postdoctoral training at the University of Colorado Medical Center in Denver. And here I want to share with you what happened there and what got me so interested in the interface between psychology and education. I went out to Denver mainly to get more training in psychological testing and psychotherapy. And the very first day, different people try to convince you to do electives in their program. And one of the staff members got up and she said that, hadn't even known this, they had a therapeutic day school there for kids who really could not make it in the Denver schools. And it was a very comprehensive school program as well as clinical program. And she even described it, I remember it was the psychoeducation program. And the kids loved it. They said, we're psycho, try to educate us. So I was intrigued by it. Anyway, I could spend hours with this, but I ended up spending probably 30 to 40% of my time in the psychoeducation program. And it was at that moment, connecting the dots backwards again, when I witnessed things that I had not really had experience with before. I saw that some of the best therapy that I ever saw was taking place in the classrooms. And at one point I gave a talk where I said some of the best therapists I've ever met don't call themselves therapists. They're teachers, and they have far more of an impact on the life of a child than I could ever have. And let me just forward this here. I'm going to sometimes forget, if you can excuse me, to forward the slides, but you do have, I know, the PowerPoint. So it was at that point in Denver that I said, whatever I do in my career, I'm really going to see the interface between psychology and education. And then what happened is I came back to the Boston area, and for the next 3 years, I worked at the Boston University Medical Center, which is in basically the inner city of Boston. And most of my work was setting up programs for at-risk kids in the Boston schools. And I truly loved the experience. And I remember saying to my wife, I'd probably spend the rest of my career working here. But once again, you sometimes don't know what's going to happen. And now I want to share with you an experience that was to change my life forever. And if it had not happened, I probably would not be giving this webinar today, or not even have been interested in certain topics which were to become primary areas of interest for me. I got a call from the head of McLean Hospital. McLean Hospital is one of the oldest psychiatric hospitals in the United States. It was founded in 1811. It's a teaching hospital for Harvard Medical School. Interestingly enough, though, McLean had not had services for children or adolescents until the 1970s. In the 1970s, they decided that they wanted to set up a child and adolescent program for finally to serve children and young adolescents. And those were the days before managed care. They were going to focus on inpatient care. And those were the days kids were going to be in the hospital anywhere from 2 to 3 months, even up to 2 years. And I got a call from the head of McLean. It's so many years ago in the 1970s. Sometimes it seems like yesterday as I connect the dots going backwards. And the head of McLean, and I'm going to now talk about this, basically said to me, Bob, we're going to need a school here. I've read about your work in the inner city of Boston. How would you like to apply to become first principal of this school in the psychiatric hospital? I must tell you, I smile as I say this. I was so young and naive. My first thought, I never said it to him, was a principal. Wow, I could actually be the boss here. Tell me that wasn't naive. Anyway, I foolishly applied for the job. They foolishly offered. I foolishly accepted it. The first 2 months were wonderful. They were the planning phase. I hired my entire staff of clinicians and teachers. I just loved it. And I remember saying to my wife after 2 months, I miss working in the inner city, but this new job is a job made in heaven. I said this too quickly because that changed very rapidly. What happened was, then the kids arrived. Have you ever noticed that schools are very different without the students there, especially in a locked door unit of a psychiatric hospital? Now, all of us are feeling stressed right now. And some people have said to me, when did you really start getting interested in topics like stress and resilience? I said, when I was principal at school in the locked door unit, within, I would say, 6 weeks of the kids arriving, I totally burned out emotionally, physically, and spiritually. I wasn't sure what I was doing. The staff wasn't sure what they were doing. And one of my favorite questions I often ask people is, of all the experiences you've had as a mother or a father or as a professional, what have been 1 or 2 of the best moments you ever had, and what made them so good? What are 1 or 2 of the worst moments? What made them so difficult, but what did you learn from both? And so, as I connect the dots going backwards and look back to those days, probably the worst day I ever had was the day I decided to write my resignation letter, because I felt that the kids were actually getting worse than better in my care. I ripped up that resignation letter, and that could be a whole other talk. And I realized something, which is going to sound so simple to all of you now, and we'll look at it even more fully later. I realized that what I was doing and the staff was doing, we were very, very negative. That what I call discipline was really very punitive. We saw the kids in a very negative way. And I realized that these kids were not going to change unless myself and the staff changed. But of course, the big question is, what could we do differently? And there was one boy, I'll tell you about a couple of kids, one boy along the way where I put him in the quiet room. I still remember this. God, it's embarrassing to tell you. Something like 6 or 7 straight days. And by about the 7th day, he looked at me, and I'm going to keep this very clean, but you could add a few words to it. He said, "Hey, Brooks, why do you keep putting me in the quiet room?" And I gave this intellectual answer. I said, "It's a place for you to reflect upon your inappropriate behaviors to change." I can't believe I spoke to a 13-year-old like this. And he looked at me and he cursed. And I said to him, "You're going to spend another day in the quiet room." And he said, "You don't get it, do you, Brooks?" And I said, "Get what?" "We're going to outlast you." And I remember going home that night saying to my wife, "I don't think my techniques are working." And I realized what I was doing was not working, what the staff was doing. And then a boy was admitted to the hospital that I want to spend a little time with you, because little did I know what I was to learn from this boy who's, about 13, I'd say at the time. What I was to learn from him, little did I know, was a strategy that was going to lead to one of the most important strategies in helping kids be more resilient. I'll call the kid Billy. He had learning problems. That was almost the least of his problems. He was very violent. He would just start hitting for no reason other kids, the staff. Billy was also born with one arm. But the other arm, when he was admitted, it was like he had lifted weights for years. And he was very frightening to all of us. And then one day we had a staff meeting, and some of the staff even said, "Maybe he just doesn't belong here." And I'm sitting there saying, this is a locked door unit in a psychiatric hospital. Where else could he go? He's 13. And that afternoon, another boy had been admitted the day before and was spending his first day in school. And this other boy also was Billy's age and had some kind of muscular problem. He also had behavioral problems that when he walked, he always seemed like he was going to fall over. I forget exactly what kind of muscular problem now. And what I'm going to describe to you now, I almost say if there are gods of therapy, they sent both of these boys to me to really say, you've got to do things differently. You've got to help kids to be more resilient. And this is what happened. This other boy was walking by, and as I said, he always looked like he was going to fall over, and he walked by, and I was with Billy, and Billy noticed him, and Billy and I had almost no conversation in the couple of weeks he had already been there. And he said, "What's the matter with him?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Look how he's walking." And I just said he has some kind of muscular problem. And then I could not believe what happened next. And as I said, it was to set the tone for a total change in my philosophy, because I couldn't believe it was Billy. He said to me, "If he starts to fall, would you catch him?" First, I couldn't believe he was asking it. I said, "I would never let any kid fall. Of course I would catch him, Billy." And then he said to me, and this level of empathy, I almost could not believe, given Billy's violence, he said, "He must feel really terrible." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, look, there's something wrong with him and his body." And what came next, at first I thought Billy was kidding. And I'm telling you this in detail because of what's going to follow. I thought Billy was really kidding. He looks at me and he says, "I don't know if you've noticed. There's something wrong with my body. I was born with one arm." I almost thought he was kidding. And I said, "Yeah, I've noticed." And he said, "Well, I feel pretty bad about it." And I said, "I can't believe this is the same kid who has been hitting us and we've had to restrain." And then he says, making it even more intriguing, he said, "I think I can help him." And I said, "You think you can help him?" He said, "Yeah." And then he looks at me, he said, "What if we had a meeting, you, me, and this other kid, and maybe we could just chat?" I don't know if any of you ever read the book Tuesdays with Maury about the professor at Brandeis University with ALS, and Mitch Albom, a former student and a sports writer in Detroit, interviewed Maury as he was basically dying with ALS about his philosophy of life. Well, years later, the book came out years later, but I thought I could have written a book Fridays with Billy. The first meeting, it was only going to be 10, 15 minutes. We're sitting there, And Billy is actually almost like a therapist with this particular kid. I still remember the first session so vividly. I poured juice for both of them. Billy stopped me when I had filled the other kid's glass halfway, and he said to the other kid, "Dr. Brooks is only going to fill your glass halfway." And I looked surprised, and the other kid looked surprised and said, "Well, why?" And only Billy could get away with this. He said, "I don't know if you realize you shake a lot. And if Dr. Brooks fills your glass up the entire way, guess what? You may spill some on his carpet. And he has a nice carpet." And then Billy said, "But he'll fill your glass up the other halfway, right, Dr. Brooks?" And I said, "Yes." And it was after that experience, and we met every Friday for about 10, 15 minutes. After that experience, I never had another violent outburst with Billy. He actually became almost a model student, I would say. People really loved him. And what I learned, and we're going to talk more about at that point, is it is almost impossible for someone to be resilient. And what I mean by resilient is the capacity to bounce back from adversity. We're all going to face adversity. God, this is certainly such a trying time now. But resilient people more and more see these difficult times as challenges to confront and master rather than as stress to avoid. And I realized one of the most important things is Billy started to change, and it really came from him. And that when he felt he was making a positive difference in this world. And I started realizing that with any kids I worked, and I was working primarily with kids with special needs, that it would be almost impossible for them to be resilient unless they felt they were making a positive difference in this world. And little did I know, so many of my strategies, as you'll hear when I go into schools with kids who are struggling, one of the first questions is, if I interviewed this student and asked this student, what is one thing he or she does at the school that makes a positive difference, could every student tell me this? And that was to set a framework then for some of the work then I was going to certainly do. So let me continue with this journey. This talk was in many ways the beginning of the power of mindsets. Mindsets have become a very prominent concept in the fields of education and psychology. I just want to give you a definition. Different people use different definitions. I say mindsets are the assumptions and expectations we have for ourselves and others that guide our behavior. Mindsets play a very powerful role in impacting in our behaviors in all situations and our interactions with others. First of all, one of the things looking back, connecting the dots backwards, that really was a very difficult for me was I had, in the beginning of my career at McLean Hospital as the principal of that school, and I should mention that I ended up, even though I was ready to resign after 3 months, I ended up working at McLean Hospital for 23 years, and I still do training there. Not all as principal of the school, but certainly that was to play an important role. Now, mindsets we could look at, first of all, in terms of our mindsets we have as adults towards kids. As I look back, if anyone had known me, any of the listeners back in, the 1970s, in the first few months, I had a very negative mindset. My mindset was most of these kids were out of control. Most of these kids were very oppositional, and they had to learn who was boss. And that one boy who said, "We're going to outlast you," helped me to correct certainly some thoughts about that. So we all have mindsets, which we will look at as adults, as how we relate to kids, whether we see kids as struggling or whether we see them as not trying hard enough or whatever. But the other thing is, over the years, I've collected many stories from children and teens, and adults as well, but I'll stick with children and teens right now, about their mindsets. And especially working with a lot of kids who struggle with school, some of the mindsets they have are so negative. We know this. So they already, when they approach learning tasks, begin to feel, I'm not going to do very well. I remember one boy who actually said to me, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? He was only 9 years old. I remember a girl who said to me that, and she was 10 years old, said to me, I think from the time I was born, I've made everyone unhappy. And these are just several. One boy said to me, and he was a kid hospitalized at McLean, he said, Dr. Brooks, I've never told anyone this, but I think you're really trying to understand us, which I thought was such a compliment. I think I was born with half a brain. Do you know what you can do to fill in the other half? So I realized that part of my work was really to change mindsets. Back in the 70s, I didn't use the word mindset. We probably used other words. But as we'll see, more and more, this concept has grown to greater prominence. But I started saying one of my main roles as a psychologist, as a therapist, is, first of all, I have to look at my own mindset. I have to look at the mindsets of parents and teachers who are, working with and raising children. And then I have to look at, how do you change a boy's mindset who says, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? Because as long as you feel, why me, I realized you're not going to move forward. It's a very common question. But how do you change that? How do you change why me to, there are some things we have no control over. But what we have control over is our attitude and response to things. Now, the next part I'm just going to go over quickly. You have the PowerPoint. In the 1990s, because I'm going to get to this a little later, I became increasingly interested. It really started in the 70s, but I became increasingly interested in the concept of resilience. And you'll see what I mean by a resilient mindset. I started more and more, and it goes back to the 70s, but I started asking this question. How does a resilient child or adult see the world differently from one who is not resilient? How do they see themselves differently? Because it wasn't just an academic question for me. I started to feel that the more we could articulate and identify what helps people to be resilient, the more as parents we could say almost anything we do, whether we're teaching a child something, playing a game with them, disciplining them, are we doing it in a way where they develop those characteristics that have to do with resilience? I called it a resilient mindset. And in my books and articles, I basically identified about 8 or 9 characteristics of what I would love to see in every child, adolescent, and even adult that would help them to be resilient. A certain outlook, because our mindsets then determine our behaviors. And in part, our behaviors then feed back into the mindset. But I wasn't just interested in academics because of that boy, Billy. As you'll notice, I say that highlighted the importance of social, emotional, and interpersonal factors in nurturing resilience. I really started to believe very strongly, and now we have a whole field of social emotional learning. I started feeling very strongly that we have to focus on, and I probably almost all of you are listening, I may be speaking to the converter choir, we have to focus so much, not just on academics or what I call achievement variables, but relationships. I started to feel very, very strongly that our relationships play such a huge role in whether we're resilient or not. I started also getting questions, as I mentioned, social, emotional, from very well-meaning educators who said to me, and it's even more prominent now, I would love to really focus on kids' social, emotional lives, but there's so much pressure to teach them this subject or this. And I started to write about, it's sad that a focus on what we used to call the whole child and their social emotional development and academic, that's in some quarters, focusing on social emotional was like an extra curriculum that took time away from academics. What we're really learning is that if a child feels comfortable with himself or herself, if their relationships with others are very positive, it actually facilitates learning. And so in my theories of a resilient mindset, you can almost guess one thing, which I can give credit to Billy, is I started to say, if you're going to be resilient, you have to feel you're making a positive difference in the life of others. And this next slide is really for you, those who are interested in really getting a history. I'm just going to take a little water. Of mindsets. You could Google any of these people's names. These are some of the most prominent theories, mindset theories. Julian Rodgers, you can see he was at the University of Connecticut. His was one of the first mindset theories. It was called locus of control. I don't even know if he called it mindset. And then there were other theories that came up. Bernard Wiener had attribution theory, for those who are interested. His theory, a lot of research was done with children with learning problems, because basically what his theory looked at is, what do you attribute successes and failures to in your life? And he found that, kids with higher, self-esteem and confidence, when they succeeded at something, they attributed it, they certainly gave the adults credit, but they attributed to their abilities. And so they attributed to things that they had control over within themselves. Sadly, especially, and I said a lot of the research was done with kids with special needs. There are a group of kids with special needs, when they succeed at something, whatever it was, getting a good grade in an exam, getting it in a Little League game, they would say the teacher made the test easier, the pitcher threw the ball soft. So I started saying, how do you help kids really start taking credit for their own success? And Wiener's theory also had a lot to do with mistakes. He found that kids who were more confident, if they made a mistake, it wasn't that they jumped up with joy and said, a learning experience for me, but they basically felt mistakes are experiences from which to learn. Sadly, there was a group of kids and adults who, whenever they made a mistake, they felt every mistake was like a rock around their neck, which weighed them down more and more and more. And soon they were sinking in quicksand. They attributed mistakes to things they could not change. And so one of the things, and you'll hear a little more later, one of the things I started asking is then, how do you help kids take your credit for their success? Not in a narcissistic way, of course, but how do you also help them to see mistakes as experiences from which to learn? And I know from all the kids I had worked with, especially who were struggling in school, this was not necessarily easy. So matter of fact, in the 80s, I was writing a lot about using attribution theory to set up classrooms. And then Carol Dweck, in her book Mindset, which is probably one of the best known books on mindset, her book is actually an outgrowth of attribution theory. She talked about two kinds of mindset, fixed and growth. Growth mindsets were basically attributed to those people who felt, you continue to learn. You learn from your mistakes. You continue to grow. Fixed mindsets was like that boy who said to me, I was born with half a brain. And he felt that the other half couldn't be fixed until actually we started to talk about it. Another theory, Albert Bandura, self-efficacy theory, as the name implied, he basically found, and I don't even think you needed research for this, to find this, is if you approach a task and feel you're going to be effective at it, I don't want to be overly simplistic, you're going to have a greater chance of being effective. If you approach a task and say, I'm never going to learn to read, I'm never going to learn to hit a ball in Little League or whatever it is, you already are behind the 8 ball because you're already expecting to fail. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, many of us consider him the father of the field of positive psychology. He first became famous in terms of a theory called learned helplessness, in which he basically said some people almost learn to feel helpless. And some of the research was done with kids with special needs, that they felt whatever they do, nothing was really going to help them. And they became even more upset and depressed. And then he had the shift, and he said, if there's such a thing as learned helplessness, there must be something called learned optimism. Can you help people to be more optimistic? And soon I was reading his books, Learned Optimism, The Optimistic Child. He wrote a book on happiness, and then he translated so much of this into the field of what we call positive psychology. And another well-known theory in a book called Grit, Angela Duckworth. It's a mindset theory about what helps us, and she used the concept of grit to develop grit. I truly respect all of these people, so I don't want to come across as overly critical, but I do have some criticism, just as they probably would have some criticisms of my work. So let me just say what they are. I say many of these theories place heavy emphasis on achievement. Based on my experiences, as I mentioned before, I felt that equal emphasis should be given to the significance of interpersonal relationships and social emotional variables when we describe the impact of mindsets on our behaviors. I was thinking of the research of Richard Weisbord, who's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who one of the studies he did, and I wrote an article about this a number of years ago, with middle and high school kids, he found that a much too large number of middle and high school kids judge getting good grades as more important than being compassionate and caring. And while some of the parents felt that certainly compassion and caring is important, the kids would say basically, well, why, if that's important, do we spend so much time talking about schoolwork and homework and not about these other factors? And so I felt strongly that I didn't want it all on achievement, what your achievement scores are, or grades, because as we learned from Daniel Goleman and his whole concept of emotional intelligence, that as important as IQ is EQ. And just to give you an example of sometimes when we get away from the importance of relationships, again, I very much respect Angela Duckworth's and her concept of grit. But this is what she said. In that very book, having a great coach or teachers matters tremendously, but my theory doesn't address these outside forces. And when I read this, I was stunned because I don't see this as outside forces. I don't think any kid could become more resilient if there are not adults in that child's life who can help them to be more resilient and more hopeful. Duckworth continued, it's my concept of grit. It's about the psychology of achievement, but because psychology isn't all that matters, it's incomplete. And I would argue, I say, that having a great teacher, coach, or mentor is all about psychology. Now, I have some criticism of these theories, and people will ask me, well, what theories do you subscribe to that when you go into schools and work with teachers are guiding principles for you, or when you're doing therapy with a child or an adult that guide your work? And so there are several theories I want to bring up, some so exciting because they have to do with all the research taking place with brain, in terms of brain research, that really dovetail with much more of what I consider to be a positive psychology approach, much more dovetail with the whole notion of resilient mindset. And I just find this work very exciting when I work with parents in terms of look at how we can use this and with teachers. So let's look as I continue this journey. Oh, I did add a couple of slides here. One is just to support this view. When overcoming the odds is erroneously viewed as simply a matter of individual motivation or grit, the failure to succeed is perceived as the fault of the individual, and blaming the victim becomes the most frequent response. The National Council on the Developing Child out of Harvard University, what they're basically saying here is, not that Angela Duckworth would have interpreted this way, but too many people feel if a child is not developing grit, which is perseverance and passion for something, too many people see it as the fault of the child. They're just not trying hard or whatever. And this view is even more forcefully stated by Linda Nathan in her wonderful book, When Grit Isn't Enough. She works with a lot of kids in poverty, a lot of kids of low socioeconomic from a low socioeconomic group, and she said, grit puts the focus on student initiative, often ignoring social and economic factors that can undermine the best of efforts. So what she is saying in there is, sometimes we tell kids you have to have more grit, and we're ignoring the social and economic factors that are holding them down. You could see, I would add, working with a lot of kids with behavioral problems or psychological issues or learning issues, I would say that there are those factors also, that these kids desperately want to learn. But some think they were born with half a brain. Some really think they can't. And then sometimes what happens is, as Linda Nathan says in her book, is we seem to put the burden on them that you're just not trying hard enough. So now let's look at, what theories do I use when I work with parents and kids and with the teachers? One of my favorites, about 8 years ago now, I read a book by Shawn Achor. Shawn Achor got his doctorate at Harvard University. He's one of the most well-known proponents of a positive psychology approach. He wrote a book called The Happiness Advantage, which is filled with such wonderful theory and actual case examples. And what Shawn Achor said, and he was talking about businesses, schools, whatever, because his theory applies to any setting. He said, we often make a mistake in our thinking. Too often we think it's that success leads to happiness. And there's certainly some truth to this. If you get a good grade, you feel happy. You finish a project, you feel happy. So certainly when you're doing well, you do feel happy. But Achor then raises this intriguing point. He said, actually, it's happiness that leads to success. And when I must tell you, when I first read this, because it's right at the beginning of his book, happiness, leads to success, all I could think about is, what do you put smiling faces on a student's, paper and help them to feel happy? But it goes far beyond that initial thought. And it has major implications from the first day of school, what we do to help kids. So let's look at his definition. How is happiness defined? As the experience of positive emotions, and I love this next part. Pleasure combined with deeper feelings of meaning and purpose. Guess who I thought of when I read that? That boy, Billy. Because the boy with one arm, when he started to feel he was helping others, it created positive emotions, and it lessened his angry behavior. And it really motivated him to be, much more of an active learner. Happiness implies a positive mood in the present and a positive outlook for the future. As I was reading this, I started to say, and I hope that, I don't know how this is going to come across for the teachers watching and other educators and professionals, our first job is not to teach reading or science or math. Of course, I'd be laughed out of any school if I left it at that. But our first job is to ask this question: how do I create positive emotions from the moment I first meet students? For parents, how do I create positive emotions in my homes? And right now, that is not necessarily very easy, given this as being one of the most stressful times we've ever experienced. So that, and right now, let's say with teachers, so that these students are going to be so motivated to learn from me. And then I want to emphasize this, because one workshop I gave, someone said to me, oh, if you focus on positive emotions, does that mean you shouldn't deal with feelings of anger, sadness, or disappointment? Not at all. A positive psychology approach basically says you cannot ignore these other emotions, well, I'll say negative emotions. You have to deal with them. They have to be discussed and managed. If you go to the article I wrote, my website article this past week about the coronavirus and the impact, I say we have to be very honest. All of us are feeling anxious and scared, but we also have to remain calm. I know that could be very difficult at this point, but our kids have to know, we have to validate their feelings. If they say they're scared, we have to let them know. If they say they're sad, they're not seeing their friends, except maybe through virtual reality here, or computers, I should say. So I bring this up. It doesn't mean ignoring sad feelings or worrisome feelings. They have to be identified, and we have to face them. What Achor says is positive emotions, and I say, which I believe they're housed in a positive relationship, enhance brain development and enable us to think more quickly and creatively, become more skilled at complex analysis and problem solving, and see and invent new ways of doing things. So there are things we now know, things going on in the brain, and I'll mention another person, Richard Davidson, in a couple of minutes, where we know that when positive emotions are there, don't we all want to think of our kids in terms of enabling them to think more quickly and creatively and more skilled at problem solving? Achor's work parallels that of Barbara Fredrickson. She's a psychologist at the University of North Carolina and author of one of my favorite books, Positivity. She has this whole theory called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. And I think it has major implications for the quality of the relationships we develop with students and the climate we create in schools. Again, she's done wonderful research. Not that you need necessarily research. I think most of you will agree. What she found is negative emotions narrow one's thinking and behavior. I've had calls actually this week from people. It's not surprising how upset everyone is by what's going on. But one of the things one person said to me is, it's hard for them to pay attention. It's hard for them to focus. It's hard for them to think about what to do. And so she, Fredrickson finds this, and what she said, feelings such as joy, contentment, and interest broaden the range of cognitions and behavior. Positive emotions help us to experience seemingly stressful tasks as less threatening and also to cope more effectively with stress. The challenge is how, in moments like this, or when a child is at school who doesn't feel he or she can learn effectively, how can one start to create those positive emotions so that it frees up their ability to think and to problem solve? Now I want to get to the third person and the last person on my list. Richard Davidson, as I say, is a renowned expert in the study of emotions and brain activity, and the founder of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He has highlighted, because he works with adults and kids as I do, the impact of positive emotions on children and adults. Major implications, again, for what we do as parents and how we set up classroom environments. He says, and basically he asked this question, are there things we could do that will activate parts of the brain that may not have been as activated as much before? This also has, and I can't get into today, implications for kids who have been traumatized, where we know at an early age, if you traumatize, certainly it impacts on the development of the brain. But this is what Davidson asked. Are there things we can do to activate parts of the brain that have not been activated before? And look what he's found. One of the things is when you ask people to help others, to engage in altruistic behaviors, to feel they are making a difference, it actually activates circuits in the brain that are key to fostering well-being. This has major implications. This is what that boy Billy tried to tell me. When he was engaged in altruistic behavior, helping that other boy, it activates parts of the brain. I didn't know any of this. Some of this is so new, that helped him to foster well-being, not only in himself and others. These circuits in the brain, Davidson continues, get activated in a way that is more enduring than the way we respond to positive incentives, such as winning a game or earning a prize. Oh, could I spend hours on this? But more important than giving a kid any tangible reward, I mean in terms of a prize, what Davidson found is, and what I found in my work, is this. A child helping another child, just like Billy did, is more long-lasting and more powerful than if I would have said to Billy, if you do your work, here's an award. There are activities we could build in which are helpful. One of the things, that I've, been writing about for years and applies so much to the last couple of weeks is, can we think about ways in which our children can feel they're helping others? We'll look at this in a few minutes. And this I'm going to go through quickly just as I look at, some of the time. And you could Google this, but Davidson and his colleagues actually developed a kindness curriculum. And you could see for preschool children that was used twice a week for 20 minutes. So just twice a week, 20 minutes. They were introduced to story and practices about paying attention. They were helped to regulate their emotions, and they taught to express kindness and altruism. So that was part of the curriculum. One component of the curriculum was a poster on the wall called the Kindness Garden, on which children place stickers when they have performed an act of kindness or benefited from such an act. So they had this kindness garden. Kids were so eager, these are 4-year-olds, to actually place stickers on the wall. By the way, I know older kids who do this. The initial results of this application of the curriculum were very promising. Remember, the exercise is just twice a week, 20 minutes, plus this kindness garden. And look what they found. Students who went through the curriculum showed more empathy and kindness and greater ability to calm themselves down when they felt upset. They showed improvement in the ability to think flexibly and delay gratification, skills that have been linked to health and success in life. This was so reassuring because Davidson's work found at any age, when people feel they're helping others, they're better problem solvers, they're more empathic, they can relax more. These kids, one of the parts of the program was meditation. Now, I meditate, and I must tell you, if some of you out there do meditation, for me, it's like 10 minutes a day, and I find it very important now. Someone called me and said, what do you do? I said, I have to exercise every morning with the treadmill, do some weights, and in the afternoon just for 10 minutes. And there are apps now just to take deep breaths, whatever, and, exhale and inhale. That's my meditation, but it's been helpful. They found with 4-year-olds, it already helped them to be more calm. And when I visit schools, you can see that more and more schools have been involved helping kids meditate. Let me tell you, when they're home right now, exercise and finding ways to help others, whether it's writing a note or whatever to someone, could be so beneficial. I love this. The study also found that the practices involved in helping the kids, the curriculum were, quotes, equally useful for parents and teachers who are struggling with stressful workplace or busy classrooms. And now we could magnify how stressed we are 100-fold. So what is one of the key messages to be taken from the research of Achor, Fredrickson, and Davidson? The reinforcement of positive emotions, positive relationships, and purpose serves as the foundation for creating an effective learning environment. This goes back to what I said before. And I keep saying this, I know it's so difficult now, but how can we keep positive emotions? This does not mean ignoring some of the stress we're feeling. How do we keep positive relationships and purpose even with that? Because that's going to be one of the things that helps us to deal with this. And certainly this PowerPoint was developed to help kids in school, but it really relates to everything. So a key question, which is the last half hour of my talk, is what are the characteristics of the mindset and accompanying strategies of parents, educators, and other professionals who nurture positive emotions, motivation, hope, and resilience in all students? And I say, but especially those with special needs, but we're talking about all students here. And what are the things then we do for ourselves? So this question came about actually from some educators who said to me, if you were writing a curriculum for educators to follow, what would you love to include? And I said, based on my research and the research of others, that there are certain characteristics or mindset of educators, and now I'm going to include parents and others, that could help kids to be more resilient and motivated. So let's look at what these are. One of the most important things we should never underestimate, and I almost call this the spiritual base of our work. And what I mean by spirituality is the belief that there are things we do that add meaning and purpose to our work and help others. In all the studies about resilience, when you ask resilient adults who a lot have truly faced great adversity but are really doing relatively well now in life, and you say, what do you think was one of the most important experiences you had, even with all of the difficulties you faced in life, to help you to be resilient? In every study that was ever done, the number one answer, there was at least one person along the way who truly believed in me and stood by me. We must never forget or minimize the impact of even one adult. And the late Julius Siegel, a psychologist, one of my heroes, he practiced in the Washington, D.C. area. In an article, he called that person a charismatic adult. Now, I almost wish he had not used the word charismatic, but he did, because some people misunderstand that or they have a different meaning. But let's look at his definition. He says it's an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. Gathers strength. I'm sorry here. And this is very important. And I wanted to say that even as adults, we need charismatic adults in our life. That Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, the single most common factor for children who develop resilience is at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. Sometimes we don't even know when we've served as a charismatic adult in the lives of others. And I say the impact of seemingly small gestures. I remember one time being referred a 7-year-old girl with learning problems. She was a very anxious girl. And in the beginning of therapy, any child I ever saw in therapy, I always went up to work with the school. I always felt that was so important. And I said to this girl, I'm going up to your school, and I asked her, and it seemed like a simple enough question, but I'd love to ask kids this, who would you like to be at the school meeting? And I explained I have school meetings so I can be very helpful. And she mentioned she was all-inclusive, my teacher, my parents, my principal, the school counselor, and then she said, Mr. Smith. And I'd worked with kids at that school before. I never had heard of a Mr. Smith. And I said, who is he? And she said, boy, it's so vivid in my mind. She said, oh, could he please be there at the school meeting? He makes me feel safe every morning. And I remember almost getting chilled the way she said it. Who is he? He was her bus driver. The year before, her parents often brought her to school because she was teased on the bus, and that bus driver did not set any limits. And so I spoke with Mr. Smith. He was so sweet. I actually told him about his being a charismatic adult, and he said, oh, and I couldn't believe this. He said this, I'm convinced he read one of my books or whatever. He said, you know this better than I do, Dr. Brooks. If any child comes to school already feeling worried and scared, it's harder for them to learn. And I said, oh my God. And he said to me, so you really think I should be there? I said, I don't think you have a choice at this point. And I loved his next question. What do you wear at a meeting like this? And I'm often very informal. And I said, I could often just come in with a sweater or, and he came in with a suit. And he saw I looked at the suit. He said, I've never been in a meeting like this. And I really wanted to dress up. Sometimes we don't even know. What I discovered in my research, asking people for some of their best memories of school, some went back 50 years, 40 years. Sometimes it was just a small gesture, one comment I'll remember forever. And then at one of my workshops, someone said if they're charismatic adults, are there such people as anti-charismatic adults? And I said, would you define the term? They suck the energy out of you and they put you down. And all I could think about was my 5th grade teacher, who to this day, I will not even say her name because I'm convinced if I say her name, she will appear. And I don't want to see her. She was really very emotionally abusive to kids. But thank heavens, my 6th grade teacher, Mr. Bonato, I will say his name, boy, did he make learning exciting, and just loved him. So here are some questions, by the way, you can ask. as you think about your experiences, and I'm going to go through these quickly. Who was a charismatic adult educator in your life as a child or student? What did that person say or do that made him or her a charismatic adult for you? And you have these PowerPoints. Who was an anti-charismatic adult educator in your life as a child student? What did that person say or do that made him or her an anti-charismatic adult for you? And do you use your memories of charismatic and anti-charismatic adults in your life as a child, adolescent, or even adult to guide what you do today? So let's use our own memories. So I love this. I get this question. I want to be a charismatic adult. What do I say or do to become one? So let's look at a few of the things we can say or do to be the charismatic adults in our kids' lives. One is we must truly believe that all children from birth want to learn and be successful. Psychologist Robert White in the 1950s, he was at Harvard, said within every child from birth is a drive to be effective. You see it in kids. They just want to try different things and do different things. But when I brought that up, I get this question: why do so many children and adolescents, especially some of the kids who are struggling with learning, why do they seem unmotivated? And the next slide is just so critical, because I read an article that basically said, and it focused on children with special needs, we should never say a child or adolescent is not motivated. You have to be basically dead not to be motivated. But this is a different way of looking at things. What they said is when we say someone is unmotivated, what we're really saying is they're not motivated to do what we would like them to do. And they said in this article, some children and adolescents are dominated by avoidance motivation. But why would you want to avoid if there's this inborn need to want to succeed? And it's a way of protecting themselves from situations they believe will lead to failure and humiliation or emotional and physical exhaustion. Basically, what happens is we're born with this wish to be successful and master our environment. But when after a while we think whatever we do with that learned helplessness is going to lead to failure, we use avoidance motivation. So what does this mean for us? Rather than asserting that children are lazy or unmotivated or resistant, we should ask, how do we lessen avoidance motivation in students who use it? Or what changes should we implement in the strategies we use to lessen so-called resistance avoidance motivation? So when I consult to schools and someone says this kid just doesn't care, is lazy, what I ask is, well, how do you lessen avoidance motivation in students who want to use it? Just to give you one example, years ago, there was a Carnegie report called Turning Points. And there was a school district in San Antonio where the dropout rate among Latino youth was 45% before they reached high school. Could you believe this? 45% of Latino youth dropped out before they were reaching high school in this district. This is a national tragedy. And how do you let this happen? Whether those school officials realize it or not, if you let 45% of population drop out each year, whether you realize it or not, you're basically saying, and I think it's racism behind it. These are Latino youth, they just don't care. But a group of courageous teachers said, what could we do differently? And they formed what they call the Valued Youth Partnership Program. They took 150 of the most turned off kids in school. This was one of the most at-risk kids. All 150 had already been left back twice. And all 150 were at least 4 years below grade level in reading. And they asked these 150 kids to do something. And within 1 year, the dropout rate went from 45% to 3%. I couldn't believe it as I'm reading this. I said, what did they do? They had a lot of money, gave each of these kids $50,000 and said, stay in school? No, they did something which goes along with everything I've mentioned about positive emotions. They said to these kids, we need your help. There's a group of kids in the elementary school. We wish we would have time to read to them, but we don't. Would you be willing to go down to the elementary school and read to these kids 2 to 3 hours a week? All 150 said yes. You know why I think they said yes? To get out of the middle school. But then they were really, quotes, hooked. And these kids were interviewed on 20 or 60 Minutes. This goes back more than 25 years ago. And they said, how could we drop out? We have people depending on us. One kid said, model in my community. And I think what happened was, I often say this, don't offer all these rewards to kids. Instead, give kids dignified things to do, and they will rise to the occasion. That is the reward. And again, I could give many more examples, but moving ahead, I just get to a couple of things because I want to get to the last part. So we have to view then and think about, what do we do differently? And if kids really are struggling, not to in any way say they're not trying hard enough or they're lazy, think about avoidance motivation. But then let's look at now, what are the main characteristics that I've identified in the mindset of resilient children, and how can we use this with all children, including those who struggle in school or in special needs? So what I'm going to go over now and compare it to a couple of other theories in the last 20 minutes of my talk is to look at, when I go into a school, these are the characteristics I want to see fostered or nurtured in schools. When I meet with parents, I say, this is what I want to do, have you do at home with kids, so that they will develop a much more positive attitude, a resilient mindset. For those who are interested, one of the theories of motivation I most subscribe to, which Daniel Pink in his wonderful book called Drive really emphasized, is Edward Deci and Richard Ryan. I have Deci's name up here, at the University of Rochester, have a wonderful theory, an intrinsic motivation, where they emphasize that kids will be more motivated when they feel, you can see, they belong. And we'll see this really resonates with my theory of a resilient mindset, that they feel they have some say, that they feel we are really reinforcing their competencies, and when they feel they have a sense of purpose and meaning. So there's Deci's theory, and then there's the circle of courage model that focuses on the components, as you see, of human character that are essential for healthy emotional development, including attachment and belonging, very similar to Deci, achievement and mastery, autonomy, and altruism. So all of these are talking about the need to belong, the need to feel your voice is being heard, the need that people are focusing on your competencies. So let's go through. I selected a few. The mindset of resilient children. One of the most important is this, and this goes back to, again, how do you create positive emotions to feel comfortable with and appreciate that others can be of support and help? We must create a welcoming climate, a sense of connectedness. Connections are everything. During this very problematic, troublesome time, and I wrote about, this in my last article, we have to really, the connections we have are so powerful, and we have to make sure that people are alone, that we connect with them, because we know that loneliness is such a difficult kind of experience. Matter of fact, when I interviewed a number of students between the ages of 4 and 18 and asked them, what could a teacher or school administrator do every morning to help you feel welcome in school? The two most common answers, they don't cost much money, is just think about this for a minute. Greet me by name and a smile. And I say we must also remember that students need our love and caring the most when they seem to deserve it the least. Greet me by name and a smile. There was one boy who had learning and attentional problems, and he could be a handful. He was a 7th grader. And he described to me, before I went up to school, he described his teachers. And he said, one teacher doesn't like me, I don't like her. And he asked me to tell a joke at the meeting. I said, why? He said, my other teachers who I love, they'll all smile and laugh. The teacher who I don't like, she won't even smile. I said, she won't? And then he says to me, only out of the mouth of a middle school kid with learning and attentional problems, she can't smile, Dr. Brooks. And I said, what? And then I heard one of the greatest lines of my career. I think she has paralysis of the mouth. And I said, oh my God. I went up, and as he requested, we all have, quotes, war stories to tell. I told a funny story. 5 of the 6 teachers started laughing. One teacher did not smile the entire meeting. She looked grumpy the entire meeting. And thank heavens my self-discipline has improved over the years, because there are a few times I felt like saying, excuse me, do you suffer from paralysis of the mouth? I didn't, by the way. The very next session he comes in, I said to myself, I wonder if he's even going to remember that I went up to the school. Because he wasn't interested of attending the meeting. I really like when kids can attend, but he wasn't interested. And do you think they forget? He comes in, he says, so? And I said, what do you mean? He said, did she smile? I said, no, you were right. And then he was so sweet. He said, can you help her? And all I can think of saying is, I'm not a plastic surgeon. I don't deal with paralysis of the mouth. But I bring this up. One smile, one kind word, what a difference it would have made. So think about the sense of belonging and connectedness. Think about right now social distancing and how that is interfering. But fortunately, we have technology and other things. I just saw in the Boston Globe this morning, kids in one neighborhood were going to the houses and just staying in front and writing notes and chalk to other kids. They were staying connected. This right away, I put this in. I'm going to go through this quickly. It would be very difficult to do today, obviously, because kids are not in school. But there was actually research done, and I have an article I wrote a few months ago. When school resumes, we could look at this. What they found, positive greetings at the door. A research was actually done for 200 middle school students in 10 classrooms. And I'm going to go through this quickly. PGDs, positive greetings. Say the student's name, make eye contact. This is what students told me. Use a friendly greeting such as a handshake, high five, or thumbs up. Give a few words of encouragement. Ask how their day is going. These were just simple things the teachers did. And what were the results? Excuse me. 20% increase in student engagement, 9% decrease in disruptive behavior. What they found is just these quick hellos was like an additional hour of engagement over a 5-hour instructional day because the kids were so much more tuned in. So a sense of belonging. Second thing is something I alluded to before, to believe that one can solve problems and make decisions, which promotes a sense of personal control, self-determination, self-discipline, and ownership. To reinforce the notion we are the authors of our own lives, and we can modify the negative scripts that currently direct our lives. I could talk a lot about this. I want to focus on a couple of things. Whenever I consult to schools, I love to ask staff as well as the kids, what things do you have control over? What things do you make decisions about? Do you see the third line, personal control? If you go to my website, you'll see a number of articles on personal control. The last article I wrote, what that is one of the most basic components of resilience. Resilient people focus on what they have control over. I mentioned this before. So many unhappy people that I've worked with in therapy, they focus on what they have no control over. And then they try to change it. Look, if we apply it to what's going on now, none of us really had control over the coronavirus coming here. I know some people felt actions weren't taken soon enough or whatever, but you know what? That's now done or not done. What we have control over is our attitude and response to things. And this is really very critical. All of us are unhappy. All of us, we're living a different lifestyle that 2 weeks ago we would never have dreamed of that we would be living. It's more difficult if you have children at home and also have to take care of their needs. But what I found is our attitude and response to things is so important. And we could really be helping our children during this time. When I wrote We Are the Authors of Our Own Lives, I started to feel we can help children at an early age feel they have far more control over their life than we may even realize. That boy who said, I was born to quit, I'm sorry, that was another case, who said, why did God choose me to be the one with ADHD? One of the ways I tried to be helpful was to say, we don't know all the reasons kids have ADHD, but now that we know, there are things we could do to help the situation. And so as we look at the couple of last points I want to make before I take questions, I think this is very important. That when in school or at home, if kids have certain problems, rather than solving it, because sometimes it's so easy to jump in, what we have to look at is really asking our kids, what are possible solutions? Myrna Shaw, a colleague of mine in Philadelphia, developed a whole program that she's studied now for 40 years, I Can Problem Solve. She wrote books like Raising a Thinking Child, Raising a Thinking Preteen, which someone said was an oxymoron. I don't know. But she found even preschool kids, if you give them opportunities, you can start helping them to develop problem-solving skills. That leads to personal control. So even I'm sure at home now, kids, there may be certain issues coming up, and just to try to enlist them, what do they think would be helpful? Because resilient kids really feel that they have within themselves the ability to start making decisions. We can help them to develop a positive mindset. And in schools, I do that all the time by more and more looking at the decisions kids can make. This next point is truly something a lot of people know me for. I realized at the beginning of my career, especially working with kids with special needs, when I would meet with parents, I would spend the first hour or two discussing, quotes, what is wrong with your child. At IEP meetings, we'd spend almost the whole meeting about what the kids' deficits were. It's what we call the deficit model. And at one point, I realized I was becoming more depressed at these meetings rather than helpful. Little did I know all of Achor's research and the whole research about positive emotions. And I think it was 1981, I can't believe that's almost 40 years ago. I said, I wonder what would happen if instead of at the beginning of a school meeting, or at least after just 5-10 minutes, I would ask what this child's strengths were, right at the beginning. And at that point, I coined the term islands of competence. It wasn't to deny problem areas, but I said, let's see what happens. Now, years later, if I look at those are connecting the dots backwards, years later with the research that's taking place now, I know what I was actually doing was creating positive emotions. And I remember in one meeting that a boy I had met, and I asked kids this in therapy, what do they see as their strengths? And some say, I don't know. And I say, that's okay, we'll figure it out. And one boy, a 10-year-old with significant learning problems, he told me that he loved to take care of pets. And he had a wonderful teacher and principal who made him the pet monitor of the school. What that was is he made sure the school had several pets, that the pets were well taken care of. Soon his teacher actually invited him to write a little book about taking care of pets that would be bound and put in the school library. And at first he said, I can't write. And she said, that's okay. I'll help you to write it. And by the end of the year, he lectured in every classroom in that building on how to take care of pets. And he never hid, he never hid from school again. He used to hide, not wanting to go there. So let me just show you in one school, a school for kids with learning problems, I was invited to speak. 2 years later, I came back. And they hadn't told me this. The entire lobby, every kid had drawn a picture of his or her island of competence. I'm standing basically in like a sandbox. There's a quote from, you can see right here, a quote from one of my books. And you know what it's like to walk into a lobby and all the kids have displayed their strengths or islands of competence? The teachers also used it to teach the kids about strengths and their dreams, what they believe in on that. This was funny. Some of the kids thought I was invited back a second time because I had not done a very good job the first time. And I think the teachers thought this was funny. So they asked the kids, why don't you write notes of encouragement to Dr. Brooks? I know it's impossible to see, but I hope you ace it. Good luck. It'll go on and on and on. Hope you do good. Love, Hiliani. I'm going to skip a few. This is what one principal of a school for kids with learning and attentional problems. It's hard to see, but after he heard me speak, now whenever they meet about a kid, over here it says, what are the students' islands of competence? List as many as possible, and how can you use these islands to help the student learn and feel more dignified? This principal informed me that once this form was introduced, it's like the research shows, teachers and other staff became much more creative in what to do. It's like the research, Davidson's research and Achor's, that when positive emotions are there, when you focus on the positive, it really frees us up to think more positively. Just a couple more slides and then I will be finished. I see I have about 5 minutes more. I want to mention this. In order to be feel competent, we have to help kids deal with mistakes. I think the fear of mistakes is one of the greatest fears, and it's really not the fear of mistakes or failure, it's the fear of humiliation. And I started feeling very strongly that we have to do a better job preparing kids for the obstacles they were going to face. And there's actually a book I'll refer to, Gabrielle Udingen, who wrote a book called Rethinking Positive Thinking. Her research now, when I share it with teachers, and parents could use it all, the same approach, her research really, for me, is so promising in helping kids when they face mistakes, not to use avoidance motivation, but be prepared for them. So basically, what does her research show? When you're planning a task or when you're planning some, academic lesson with the kids or a task at home, one of the questions she raises is, and we should do it as adults also, basically, here is a strategy we're developing. What are possible obstacles to that strategy? She actually has you think about it, but now it's not for a self-fulfilling prophecy for failure. But because then what she says is, think about the obstacles you may face, and when we face these obstacles, how will you handle it? See, she calls it mental contrasting. Think of the obstacles, and then how you're going to handle it. You will feel a greater sense of personal control when you are prepared to actually, for obstacles to come up, because now you know how to handle it. The most difficult thing is when you face mistakes, and it goes back to the slide about feeling a sense of personal control. When you face mistakes or problems and you don't know how to handle them, I often say to people, have you ever faced a problem that your first thought is, I don't even know where to start? And all hands go up. And I say, imagine if every problem you faced, you feel that way. That's how some people are certainly feeling the last couple of weeks. And so what her research found is, think about ways of dealing with this, because it involves personal control. What am I going to do? And the very last part of the mindset of resilient children really ties to what that boy Billy taught me years ago. That's why I spend so much time. And throughout this talk, I've given examples that resilient kids certainly feel that their relationships they have, they're good, they become better problem solving, have better problem solving skills. They can identify and use their islands of competence, that are able to deal with mistakes. And the fifth one, my books, I have close to, I think, 9 or 10, is something I'm going to underline, especially in what's going on, to feel you're making a positive difference in this world. And this belief truly represents Achor's notion of positive emotions and a sense of purpose, and Davidson's research that indicate that acts of altruism activate parts of the brain associated with well-being. And I'll just mention one example and then I'm finished. I just saw it on the news this morning when I was using a treadmill, that a high school boy in one of the suburbs of Boston read that many seniors could not get out to do shopping. And I don't know exactly how he set it up, but he on Facebook or whatever, and it spread quickly. He said, you make a list and I will do the shopping for you. And because also he felt that the seniors were the most vulnerable group he had read. And there he was going shopping for them and delivering their food. And he said, I just feel that I'm not in school. I want to be able to do something. So those are the points. I will now, I think I shift over the screen and start to take questions. So I hope I'm doing this right. I'm going to press escape. I hope some of these ideas were helpful. All of the articles I gave goes into greater detail, and every point I made, there are a number of articles on my website. So let me see. And I may need, let me get into, I'm just looking for Google Chrome now. Oh, okay.
That's perfect, Bob.
Is it? I actually did it?
Well, you
And
can.
Bob, you just press stop presenting there.
Oh, just stop presenting. Well, I did almost all of it.
You did a great job, and thank you so much. I feel like, gosh, today more than ever, this information was so topical and so relevant. I know that my own head is reeling with things I can do. I want to open it up to questions, and I know that it might be that we're kind of stepping on each other's toes. But if anyone wants to try and unmute themselves to ask Bob a question, we'll start with that. We'll see if we can do it that way. So unmute yourself if you do have a question. And if we need to, we can just go to hand raising in the chat bar. But let's see if we can do it this way. Does anyone have a question that they want to ask Bob?
This is free advice. Gee, maybe I floored everyone there.
Okay, I see we have a question that came in. So from Joan Mealy McCarthy, Bob, thank you so much. So helpful and uplifting. My first question is, how do teachers and adults reframe the blame the victim mode of thinking?
Well, first they have to do it within themselves and recognize this. It's a wonderful question, because one of the reasons I spent time going over my experience at that psychiatric hospital, I blame them. If these kids wanted to, they could get better. And one of the things I have found just very helpful is, one, you have to recognize it. Daniel Goleman in his book Emotional Intelligence says self-awareness. You have to be aware of what your mindset is. And see, when I speak with teachers, I start with the assumption, and I think most of us do, every child would love to be successful. No kid comes out of the womb, they could speak saying, oh, I want to be unsuccessful. So what I've tried to do is say, change the mindset. Never use words. I say I don't believe in censorship, and never use words like lazy, unmotivated, isn't trying. But instead say, this child really wants to be successful. What is it that I could do differently? See, what we have control over as educators is the attitude and response to kids who are struggling in school. Like that kid who became the pet monitor, that teacher, instead of saying this kid isn't trying, or I didn't even go into all the details, the kid was hitting other kids, that teacher was willing to say, if he says his island of competence is taking care of pets, then how can I use that? See, he told me that. How can I use that? And she had him lecturing in other classrooms, and a wonderful principal also did that, and also writing a brief book about this. So it's being aware of it. Again, I said I don't believe in censorship, but I wish at any time there was a school meeting about a kid and anyone raised the words like lazy or doesn't care or unmotivated, not trying, I wish someone in the room would say, let's shift our mindset. Let's look at what can we do differently so that this kid may be better able to work. It's just like that district in San Antonio. How do you get 150, some of the most at-risk kids, and you ask them to read to younger kids, and they stay in school? Goes from 45% dropout rate to 3%, because you're providing them with opportunities to be dignified. So it's being aware of it, as Goleman says, and then really reframing it. And that's why I have that slide. We ask ourselves, what could we do differently? So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Absolutely. Okay. Next question is from Jamisa. What is your advice for teachers who face mandates and expectations to have data and progression in a short time frame?
I'm laughing. Well, I'll tell you, you know what, we have almost no control over that. The reason I was laughing, and it's not in a humorous way, is we spend so much time in all of these mandates, and I think we spend far too much time. That's why one of my articles, I basically said, it's like helping kids or focusing on social emotional, we see as an extracurriculum, some people see. So let me directly answer the question. I don't think we're going to get rid of these mandates right away, and all of the, some of the testing that has to be done, although I question it. So one of the things I've tried to do with teachers, and this goes back many years when I wrote a book called, years ago, The Self-Esteem Teacher. Before I sent it to the publisher, my editor even, I sent it to several teachers I knew and a couple of principals, and I said, and it was just, a question, anything I'm suggesting in this book, will it take time away from teaching? And all of them said, it won't, not only will it not take time away from teaching, but it'll actually give us more time to teach. And I'll tell you why I say this. One of the things I started to say to teachers based on the question that was raised is, what are the small things you could do? You may not be able to change all the mandates going on, but what are the small things you could start to do in your classrooms that do not take a lot of time, but you're going to have kids who are going to be much more motivated and willing to learn? That's why, although I went through it quickly, because with social distancing, we can't, practice it as much. The research that shows, hello at the door, smile, whatever, we may not realize it, but in research I did, people remember that 40 years later. And in this, research I have on my slides, which people can refer back to, is it led to such a decrease in disruptive behavior. It led to more student engagement. So try to look at the small things, even as we struggle with some things that I personally think are not as necessary, and some testing that I don't feel is quite as necessary. And I don't know how that sounds, but I really just feel strongly that we may have no control over some of the things going on. What we have control over is our attitude and how we respond to kids in the classroom. And all of this research now coming out about positive emotions, brain development, and even positive greetings at the door. I didn't even know there was, they actually used the term PGDs on that. So I could go on and on with that, but I don't want to get too aggravated about certain things.
No, that's great. We did have a few more come in. Yeah, so Cynthia says, you talked about the kindness garden. That was in an elementary school. Have you tried something like that in a high school?
I have not, but you could. It certainly can be done. There's several high schools where kids are being kind to others. I think it would be wonderful. As a matter of fact, this year I did consultation in Glastonbury, Connecticut. They had a kindness garden. It was an elementary school again, but it could easily be applied to a high school. Kids each got a rock. What they did is they wrote some encouraging message on the rock. And this was very interesting. Any student could take one of those rocks home who felt he or she needed some encouragement, and then they would bring it back and they would do their own rocks. I don't see any reason why they could not be done in high school, at any level, these words of kindness. And it could be done, in different ways. But it was interesting to me. These were 4-year-olds. Maybe it seems easier, but I think once you're in high school, look at what the kids at San Antonio. They were asked to help out. So now they're going down and reading to younger kids. They're being kind. But look what it did to them therapeutically and educationally. As one of the kids said on 20 minutes, 20 or 60 minutes, how could I drop out? I have people depending on me. These ideas could be applied anywhere. What I always say when I give workshops, when I'm actually at the school, but this is a webinar, is here are ideas. If you think they could be helpful, your school. What would work best in your particular school? That's why with kids at home, that's why I gave the example of that high school kid who's doing shopping for senior citizens in his neighborhood. But one could think of, could young kids, 6, 7-year-olds, send notes to doctors or something, where they feel they're they're appreciating others. I think all of those could just a very important things we could do.
Absolutely. And Cynthia, if you do come up with any ideas, we would of course love to hear them. So share that. Marianne chimes in. Thank you, Marianne, for asking. So Marianne is a parent. She says, as parents with children at a school for students with learning differences, what advice would you give us to support emotionally and educationally and to feel more connected to our children during the school day? What was your experience in the school, and how do you involve parents in the classroom or out of school hours?
Wow. Well, it's interesting. When I wrote one of my first books on resilience called Raising Resilient Children, all the chapters had been written, and then I had this uneasy feeling. And I said, it needs another chapter. And the book hadn't gone to print, so it was easy enough to do. That chapter was on parent-teacher relationships and how we could work closely together. Anyway, I included that because parents are partners in all of this. And I really feel school parents, and it's all schools, but especially when our kid is struggling in school, right from the beginning of the school year, I think there has to be a lot of, communication back and forth. After when Raising Resilient Children came out, there was the assistant head of a school who said the first chapter he's going to require his faculty to read is the one, parent-teacher relationships on that. So I think, first of all, the mindset has to be, we're all in this together, and that we really have to see how we can work closely together. There are a couple of other things. There have been some teachers who have told me, well, I'll first say parents, told me the first time they hear from teachers is when there's a problem. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen. That is so obvious. And we have to see there's no blame game. One day I want to write an article, comments I've heard at school meetings that totally minimize the effectiveness of the school meeting. Like what's going on at home, or what are you doing to my child at school? And this is all obvious, but we all get caught up with different emotions. So I think parents should have a good sense of what's going on. I know some teachers have actually, and a lot of schools may do this, sent home at the beginning of the year or emailed a 2-page or 3-page information sheet almost about what I hope to accomplish, this particular year. And the more we feel we're getting into a blame game, the more we really have to step back and recognize that we're in this together. That doesn't mean there will not be disagreements, but between teachers or parents about certain, programs they're using or certain approaches they're using. But I think we have to go in with the attitude, and it has to be really a lot of empathy. Empathy involves validation. You may not agree with everything a person is saying, but you validate what they're saying. You try to understand it. Because kids will do much better when all the adults in their lives are working closely together. Look what that, Mr. Smith, the bus driver, what an impact he had. The parents had not even realized the impact. They just knew things were better on the bus.
All right. So I do see a number of questions coming through, and we will try to.
What they've gone. I've seen some going through, but they stay on for so.
I know. That's okay. I don't mind sharing them with you. So Sherry asks, she actually is a current tutor that just started working with the Summit School using her background. And she says she would like to get involved in the field without having to go back to school. Do you have any ideas?
Well, whatever she's doing now, I mean, there are just different approaches. Like this past year, I gave a talk for a group called the Association of Educational Therapists in California. They're a group that have really mixed education and clinical interventions, and they have a certain accreditation. If someone wants to go on for it depends what direction you want to go in. Sometimes I get, calls from people or emails about psychology. And I say nowadays there are a number of, wonderful programs, and there are these professional schools where people go where the emphasis may not be as much on research as it is on actual clinical and consultation work. So there are a number of different avenues that one could certainly go in. There are different groups there that exist. This Association of Educational Therapists is an interesting group, and a number of them with, doing tutoring, but they do far more than that. And but the focus is on both the emotional and academic life of the child.
All right, wonderful. Well, Sherry, keep doing what you're doing with me.
Yeah, I'm at school. That's a great place to be.
So let's see here. Dr. McCarthy, can you give some words to teachers who are overwhelmed themselves with large classes, mandates that may not be feasible or easy to fulfill to find their own happiness in the face of difficult work expectations. Happiness starts from within, right?
You know, it does. This could have been a whole other talk I give because it really touches also on one of the other questions. One has to say, and this is what I did, even when things were better at the psychiatric hospital. What do I have control over? What don't I have? There were things that I wasn't as thrilled about. I love working in McLean. It was, it's one of the top psychiatric hospitals in the world. But I had to say, okay, this I'm not as thrilled about. This meeting I'm not as thrilled about. This, but what is it that I am? One of the things that I often tell teachers is, Julius Siegel, in that article where he introduced the notion of charismatic adult, he said in a surprising number of cases, the charismatic adult in a child's life turns out to be a teacher. And so there's a talk I give, I couldn't give it today, but it's a talk I give called, Can You Take Care of Your Students If You Don't Take Care of Yourself? And in there, I go over some of the principles like personal control. What do you have control over? And that's where I go into something called therapeutic lifestyle changes. It's a very exciting area of psychology. TLCs, I used to think it was tender loving care, but psychologists have actually said, let's look at, are there certain things that even if you're in a stressful job, but you want to stay in the job, it's not that you want to quit, that things may not change as much in the job, but are there things you could do which will really help? Some of the things, are very obvious. It's what's being suggested. Almost any article I get about how during this time of social distancing, staying in our homes, what can we do? People talk about exercise. John Rady, a psychiatrist in Boston, wrote a book called Spark, where he talks about research that shows when kids arrive at school, the first thing they should be doing is not going to a desk, but doing aerobic exercise for 10 minutes. And there should be more exercise built in. Well, I know every morning, and I'm going to be more religious about it because I'm home, I'm not even on the road, I have to use the treadmill and I have to do weights or whatever. I know in the afternoon, do meditation. But even if we were not faced right now with the coronavirus, I started looking at this research on, these therapeutic lifestyle changes that have been proven to be so helpful that, again, there's going to be stress at work, but it's really what balances that. And also, when I work with teachers, when talk about the stress at work, one of the things I bring up is the following, that we have to remember that one of the lifelong impact we have, and this, I don't want that to be what we call compassion fatigue, which is something else I'm interested in, but to recognize every comment you make to a kid, it's not to put more pressure on yourself. They may remember years later. When I wrote the book, The Self-Esteem Teacher, I found, and I collected memories years later, people remembered a kind word said by a teacher. So I say that, just remember the purpose is here, but you've got to take care of yourselves. That's why I label that talk, can you take care of your students if you don't take care of yourself? The same could be true of parents. Can you take care of your children if you don't take care of yourself? We all have to find ways, but we know there are certain ways that we have to be more disciplined about engaging in, and especially now. Like I'm looking out the window, it's a little sunny. I think it's colder today, but I know my wife and I said, we'll just go out and take a walk and just get out.
Absolutely. And now more than ever too, again, Bob, it's what you're saying is so important. I see a few more.
Okay.
So Karen asks, do you think that the rise in the homeschooling movement offers the hope of changing quote unquote mainstream education by modeling more positive social emotional paradigms?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Actually, I spoke at a social emotional learning conference, and someone raised a similar question. I'm really not an expert on that. And so I don't like to go into the fields I'm not an expert in. It may, but you could see the hesitancy in my voice. Certainly, I hope what's going on at home on homeschooling is very positive. And most of the people I've met who homeschool, some of them homeschooled in desperation because they felt the schools were not meeting the kids. Initially, many of the homeschool people who were homeschooling, I found, this goes back years ago, was more for religious reasons. And then when I started speaking at national conferences like CHAD and LDA, I found a number of parents felt the only way their kids were going to have a positive school experience was homeschooling. So I hope the positivity of the home environment, I hope for all kids, could also be found in schools, when they go to schools. I don't know if it's an interesting question, if there's been research about that or whatever. For me, whatever the environment, how do we create those positive emotions? And that's why this research, even on positive greetings at the door, I hadn't known some of this, and I couldn't show it today, but video clips of different schools and what they do about positive greetings at the door. And little did I know that, I've been talking about it, but I didn't know there was actually research going on to look at what happens, in regard to those.
Okay, sorry, I was just unmuting there.
Oh, I know there's going to be like a little delay.
Yeah. And Elizabeth and many others have just sent notes of gratitude. Elizabeth says she loves that she has takeaways to send to her class this week to give them a chance to help others. Notes to neighbors, chalk on the driveways, letters to nursing homes, islands of competency to identify and send to me. I can tell parents of multiple children that they can frame a positive interaction between an older and a younger sibling. I would love to see this happening in my own home right now.
Yeah, that's a whole other issue.
No, they're hanging in there. As a chance to help a younger sibling and the parent using his superior knowledge, knowing that it will help the older one too. What a blessing, indeed. And we do have so many takeaways to really, and many opportunities over the next few weeks to try some of these in our own home, don't we? And it looks like
for 1 second.
Absolutely.
If people try that, I do. You know what I would love, because I would love to share it. Either they could send it to you and to me. Mm-hmm. And what actually, in my last website article, I asked people to let me know how they might be handling things. So if people try different things, probably my next website article also is going to be about what we're facing with the coronavirus, and I would love to share some ideas. So maybe they could email you and me, or somehow. And the more we could share these ideas, the more connected we are. I just feel it just be so helpful. So I'm sorry for interrupting, but I just really wanted to mention that.
No, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. And your contact information was on the front page of the PowerPoint. Everybody has my contact information.
Right.
And I think that's a great idea. One silver lining that I personally feel coming out of all of this is all of these really wonderful groups and networks that everyone is building. So I think that here's another resource for everyone during this situation. I won't say difficult time. I'll say opportunity for networking and building new relationships in a new way. Before we end, Dr. Brooks.
Can I say one more quick thing? All of a sudden, quickly flashing. Thank you notes. I want to thank everyone. It felt a little weird almost not being able to see anyone, but thank you for your kind notes. I'm sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
No, absolutely. You are doing, this was wonderful. And I cannot thank you enough for your ability to jump right in and learn this technology along with me. And of course, we cannot thank Ian Walsh enough for his patience with both of us as we learn this as well.
Very patient. Thank you, Ian.
But Bob, if you do have any other resources to share, definitely send them our way. Otherwise, I hope that everybody has a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
And let me just mention again, I'm sorry, one other, I'm interrupting this, but one other just thing is, I am constantly on my Facebook page, and the easiest way to get there, as I mentioned at the beginning of my website page, I am trying to list different resources with some excellent ideas. So people could go there as well. They could read the article I sent out on Monday, but I'm constantly updating on my Facebook page particular articles. So I wanted to mention that as well.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Stay well.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks for your notes. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.